I'm now going to sit down and take my role as moderator to introduce the next panel. And I want to say on behalf of those of us who have been here that we are quite appreciative of how far many of our panelists have traveled and the time that they have taken out of their busy lives to be able to be here with us. We hope we will be able to invite many of them back individually, because it is quite frustrating to have only 15 or 20 minutes of their presentations, since each of them has a world of things to tell us about. Our first speaker on this panel is Vincent Nmehielle, who is the principal defender of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. He's also Associate Professor of Law at the University of the Witwatersrand, Wits School of Law in Johannesburg, South Africa. His remarks today will address the topic, Preventing and Responding to the Crime of Genocide, Interrogating the African Union Response in Darfur.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's always very difficult to make a presentation after lunch. It's either because you can fall asleep while presenting, or the people listening to you could fall asleep and be yawning. But whatever the case is, I hope you are alive through the process, the 20 minutes that I have. Let me use this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this program. And I want to give special appreciation and thanks to Baba Femi, who prevailed on me to really find time to be in this program, which has proved very, very useful within the period we've been here. And let me also say how privileged I am to be standing with some of those I regard as the generals in this field that we were here to address, particularly Professor Mendes and Ambassador Scheffer, who have worked in this area and contributed a lot. I'm indeed privileged to be standing on the same podium with them to give this, and more so also Francis Deng, who was here and gave the keynote. Now, I will try as much as possible to work within the 20 minutes that I have, even though there's a whole lot to say. I could very much lament by possibly looking at my introduction and then give a few remarks with regard to the body of my presentation, and then finally conclude also in a lamentation that could be, evoke maybe the discussions and questions eventually that we're going to have. I want to interrogate the AU response. AU stands for the African Union, to the Darfur crisis. And I begin by saying that the theme of this conference, genocide, crime unpunished, lessons unlearned, evokes a sense, almost in a helpless manner, that history has been ignored despite the existence of a very glaring history of untold human sufferings as a result of blatantly violent and very brutal actions of other humans. The atrocities committed during World War II and the Holocaust led to the never again mantra, which in turn led to the founding of the United Nations based on the world's determination, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, unquote. The lessons of World War II and the Holocaust did not deter other massive and egregious human rights violations that run through human history, either as a result of orchestrated state dictatorial tendencies or well-planned campaigns of armed conflict that continue to bedevil our world, particularly in Africa. Africa and the world got another wake-up call when almost 1 million people of Tutsi origin in Rwanda were decimated by their Hutu brothers and sisters. And I use the word brothers and sisters in quote. In 1994, almost within the same period that the former Yugoslavia in the Balkans burned under a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Indeed, the world slept while the massive extermination of innocent people was going on, more so in Rwanda than in the former Yugoslavia. I'm referring to the sleeping of the world. In view of the lack of quick action on the Darfur crisis, can we truly say that the world got a wake-up call as a result of the events of Rwanda and former Yugoslavia? The situation in Darfur presents another case of how to judge the reaction of the world to what has been described as, quote, the first genocide of the 21st century. It has been observed that the atrocities, quote, in the Darfur region of Sudan have resulted in more lives lost than the situation in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Somalia, and Algeria combined. According to one commentator, quote, a day in Darfur may mean waking up to aerial bombardment of one's village, followed by ground forces known as the Janjaweed, stealing one's livestock, burning one's home, shooting one's father, and raping one's sister. One may flee the racial insults and gunfire only to find oneself as a refugee or trapped in an internally displaced person's camp without any recourse against one's victimizers, unquote. There have been other numerous descriptions of the massive atrocities that have been and are still being committed in Darfur, whether in the garb of genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, mass killings, serious humanitarian situation, or crisis, or egregious violations of human rights. This paper does not dabble into the definition of genocide. Of course, others have dealt with that, and there are other numerous contributions and articles that deal with that. Whatever the description or definition given to the atrocities, there is one general agreement, that the situation in Darfur has gone out of hand, having led to untold human sufferings, and therefore deserves an adequate and formidable response and intervention by the world community. Under the responsibility to protect doctrine, it can be safely said that the state with the primary responsibility to protect its citizens, has either failed or is unable or unwilling to do so. Hence, the need for the international community to intervene in a dispassionate manner, having the suffering masses as their main objective. Unfortunately, the need to intervene is either because of some other interests rather than the sufferings of the masses. And now, of course, the need to intervene should only be because of the sufferings of the people, rather than whether it will give easy access to oil or whether other interests abound. This paper deals with the African response in the Darfur atrocities. It seeks to interrogate the African Union intervention initiatives in this continuing menace. The paper examines the African Union engagement with the Darfur issue in terms of its dealings with Sudan as a member state of the AU. It evaluates the impact of the African Union mission in Sudan in dealing with the crisis. Now, I would like to give a background to the response by the AU. Of course, we do know that the AU succeeded the Organization of African Unity. And under the doctrine of the main objective or principle of the former OAU, there was the doctrine of non-intervention in the internal affairs of member states. And that became a sacrosanct principle for OAU member states. But with the founding of the AU in 2002, there was this whole idea that it was aimed at revamping the tendency of the AU having the reputation of one that allowed nations to run mad and wild without the need to intervene in its internal affairs. Therefore, the new continental body was thus conscious of the fact that the scourge of conflicts in Africa constitutes a major impediment to the social, economic development of the continent and of the need to promote peace, security, and stability as a prerequisite for the implementation of our developmental and integration agenda, unquote. In this regard, two important objectives of the AU are, one, to promote peace, security, and stability on the continent, and secondly, to promote and protect human rights in accordance with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and other relevant human rights instruments, unquote. The shock of the massive atrocities in Rwanda in the early 90s and the failure of an effective African response under the auspices of the old OAU worked on the minds of African leaders, one will think, leading to the enunciation of an African version of Never Again with the founding of the AU. In this regard, while the doctrine of non-intervention in the internal affairs of member states remains one of the principles of the AU Constitutive Act recognizes, quote, the right of the Union to intervene in a member state pursuant to a decision of the Assembly in respect of grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, unquote. In addition to, quote, the right of member states to request intervention from the Union in order to restore peace and security, unquote. Tackling the Darfur crisis, therefore, is or was one of such situations envisaged at the founding of the AU because of the presence of, quote, grave circumstances that Article 4H of the AU Constitutive Acts underscores, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Irrespective of the arguments and politics as to whether what is happening in Darfur is genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or ethnic cleansing, it must be underscored that for the purposes of the African Union's Constitutive Act, which requires the AU to intervene, grave circumstances having arisen in Darfur make it inevitable for a proper response on the part of the continent. Now, the problem is whether the AU saw its need to intervene within the parameters of grave circumstances as enunciated in the Constitutive Act. Unfortunately, I'm one of those who passionately will think that nations say what they mean and really mean what they say, particularly in constitutive documents of regional bodies. The Darfur region, of course, has witnessed a number of conflicts that led to what we are having today in terms of the atrocities that go on. But of course, the latest in the atrocities occurred in 2003 when the rebel group, the SLMA movement stroke army, thought that it was enough that the Darfur region would suffer under the hands of the government and its surrogate militia, the Janjaweed, and attacked a government institution or government establishments within the Darfur area. And of course, that led to the so-called counterinsurgency that has brought about the untold sufferings in Sudan, particularly in Darfur. Despite the mass atrocities being committed in Darfur, the larger outside world stood aloof until Idris Deby of Chad, a country directly affected by the Darfur conflict from day one, due to the overflow of refugees and other security concerns across its borders, engaged in the mediation efforts between the parties and mediated an initial ceasefire agreement on the 3rd of September 2003. Of course, that soon collapsed. It was only after that collapse that the AU would step in what is referred to, because of the magnitude of the conflict, especially the growing humanitarian crisis. This became the reason for the AU to intervene and led to the eventual humanitarian ceasefire agreement and a protocol on the establishment of humanitarian assistance in Darfur, which were signed under the auspices of the AU and in collaboration with the mediation efforts of Chad on April 8, 2004. It is important to know that within this period, the African Union, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, passed a resolution reminding Sudan of its obligations under the Constitutive Act of the African Union, the Charter of the United Nations, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as other regional and international human rights instruments and international humanitarian treaties to which Chad is a party. The resolution expressed deep concern over the prevailing quote situation in Darfur, particularly the continuing humanitarian crisis such as mass killings, sexual violence as a means of warfare, and the abduction of women and children. In the resolution, the African Human Rights Commission accepted to embark on a fact-finding mission to Darfur to investigate the reports of human rights violations, pursuant to a decision of the AU Peace and Security Council on the Darfur crisis, requesting, among other things, the Council encouraging the AU Commission on Human and People's Rights to dispatch a mission to Darfur to investigate reports on human rights violations in Darfur. Of course, the Peace and Security Council of the AU is a version of the United Nations Peace and Security, and therefore is entitled to make decisions, pass resolutions on what they perceive to be a threat to peace and security in the region. The AU Assembly itself, which is the highest political body, also issued a decision. The AU decision on its part was that the Assembly of Heads of State examined the situation in Darfur and said that it is a serious concern, it has a serious concern over the prevailing situation in the Darfur region of the Sudan, particularly the humanitarian crisis and the continued reports of violations of human rights, including attacks against civilians committed by the Janjaweed militia and other non-regular armed groups, and reiterates the need to bring to justice all those responsible for human rights violations. Now, the decision went further to say that although the situation in Darfur is so serious, it cannot be said to be genocide. The AU decision said that, of course, there were other, following from a number of other things that have been said, as to whether or not the decision is what is happening in Darfur, or what was happening in Darfur was genocide. I think my point remains that, irrespective of what it was, there was on record mass violations, crimes against humanity, and war crimes were going on, sexual exploitation. So it doesn't really matter as to whether or not we will all agree on the term genocide. That has been overflowed today in this presentation. Now, I observe that on a closer examination of the background to the AU response to the Darfur crisis, we can see four things clearly that shaped the AU's response and intervention initiatives in Darfur. First, the African Union refused to define the atrocities in Darfur as genocide, even though it accepted that the situation were grievous and stressed the need to bring to justice all those responsible for human rights violations in Darfur, unquote. There was, however, no concrete description of the situation other than humanitarian crisis from the point of view of the Assembly of States parties, or what it called humanitarian situation. One wonders whether the AU took into account the grave circumstances recognized by the Constitutive Act, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, as requiring a formidable, as a need for intervention by the body. Secondly, the African Union saw the Darfur situation as an African problem for which Africa must take the lead in addressing. It clearly indicated that this is an African problem in its decision, and therefore it is Africa that will address it. Thirdly, the AU saw nothing more than a political situation as central to addressing the problem, despite the human rights violations that went on. And fourthly, the AU saw, of course, as part of the political solution, Sudan was a brother or a colleague member state that didn't need to be embarrassed, maybe publicly. So because of these four issues, the response that AU adopted were shaped in two ways: what I consider to be either the political and diplomatic response, and what it refers to as the operational aspect. The political response was nothing more than the need to seek a peace agreement, resulting in a number of diplomatic shuttles between Addis Ababa, Khartoum, Abuja, and N'Djamena. Of course, at the end of the day, a lot of time was spent on running about the cities to press upon the parties to agree to some form of peace agreement. Of course, the former chairperson of the AU Commission was wearied going back and forth. But at the end of the day, there was the so-called temporary peace agreement, the humanitarian ceasefire agreement, which of course suddenly fell apart. And after that, what next? The next thing that happened was the need to monitor the ceasefire agreement. And the only way to do that was to establish an African Union mission, which became what they referred to as the operational part. You can imagine Darfur is said to be the size of France. And the first initiative of military observers that were sent were 360 military observers. And it took for a long while in terms of every frustration that was put on the way of the observers to operate by the Sudan government. And thereafter there was a reassessment, and it was agreed the need to enlarge the military observer mission. And mind you, the mandate of the mission was not to protect civilians as such. The issue of protection was left as the obligation of the government of Sudan, which is using the Janjaweed. So the reassessment resulted in the enlargement of the military mission to 3,120 or thereabout, which still was not enough. There was a third initiative, but at the end of the day resulted in nothing but, 7,000 troops, again found not to be enough. Now 7,000 troops were not enough, neither was there enough capacity to deal with the mission, neither was there enough money to deal with the mission. That is what is referred to as the Army's African Mission in Sudan 1, 2, Phase 1 and Phase 2. And ultimately, there was a joint UN mission with the African Union that said, well, there's a need to enlarge this, and the hybrid mission came into being, which is yet to be fully operational. And of course, your guess would be good as mine in terms of the number, 26,000. Now, from 360 people, it is now found that 23,000 will be enough to deal with the situation in Darfur. Well, let me conclude. The difficulty was so much the AU had no capacity, no resources to deal with it. In fact, the AU did not know what hit it when it embarked on Darfur because it was not prepared. Give me time, therefore, here I have 1 minute just to conclude. In the words of the former chairperson of the AU, His Excellency Alpha Conare of Mali, the conflict that unfolded in Darfur since 2003 has been the biggest challenge posed to the AU since it was launched in Durban, South Africa in July 2002. Indeed, in many aspects, the situation in Darfur is perceived as a test of the AU's capacity to resolve conflicts and determination to fully implement the relevant principles stipulated in its constitutive act. There is no gainsaying the fact that the AU was not prepared for what hit it in Darfur. The continental body has no doubt rallied round to see how best to address the situation. It seemed, however, to have placed politics above the glaring violations of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law on the part of the Sudanese government. Despite the glaring daily atrocities committed against innocent civilians, the brutal rape of women and girls, and the destruction of villages, the AU remains soft on the Sudan. The AU must be in a position to apply strong political and other pressures on Sudan to bring home its commitment to the principle in its constitutive act that the former chairperson of the AU Commission alludes to above. The AU, which has agreed with the UN that the hybrid mission in Darfur should have a predominantly African character, and that the troops should be, as far as possible, sourced from African continent, must ensure timely provision of the troops by their member states. While as an African, this writer appreciates the emphasis on the African character of UNAMID, and for it to be Africa-led, the Sudan must not be given an opportunity to use this emphasis to continue to frustrate the proper takeoff of the mission. The AU cannot afford to fail the people of Darfur unless it wants another Rwanda. The people of Darfur, like the people of the small island of Anjouan in the Comoros, would love to cheer the AU for liberating them from their sufferings. They would also want to see that those found to have violated international humanitarian law are made to account one way or the other. Of course, I refer to the Anjouan people, which 1 week ago was liberated by the forces of the African Union against a dictator who took over the island. If the AU could send forces to liberate the small island of Anjouan and make the people happy, yes, the circumstances may be a little bit different. The AU can as well do something in Darfur to press home the message to President Bashir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome to the podium now Ambassador David Scheffer. He's the Mayor Brown Robert Helman Professor of Law and Director of the Center for International Human Rights at Northwestern University Law School. He's the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues. We're very pleased also to welcome him in the last couple of years as an addition to the academic human rights community here in Chicago. He brings with him important experience and is someone who has a lot to contribute here, as have the rest of our panelists, both jurists, activists, and academics. David Scheffer, thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. It's a great privilege to be with Vincent and Samuel on this panel today here at the University of Chicago. I always enjoy driving a very short distance south to do this. Frankly, Vincent, if you had wanted 10 minutes of my time since you flew in from Africa, you could have taken it. I always feel like they deserve more time than those of us who live in proximity to the speaking locale. I also just want to tell Vincent, and it'll be of interest to some of the students in the audience, that just a few days ago, one of our first-year students at Northwestern Law came in, and I'd been working with him to see if we could position him for the summer working at the Yugoslav Tribunal in The Hague. But as opposed to almost all the other students who are applying, and a lot of them get these positions with the prosecutors or the chambers, the judges of these tribunals, this student had wanted to work with defense counsel, which I had encouraged very strongly. And he came in and rushed and he said, I've been accepted to work with the defense counsel. And I just want to note that I consider that to be a truly, truly noble endeavor with the criminal tribunals, to be working on the defense side and making sure that due process is being fully complied with. There's a lot of lessons that could be learned about the role of defense counsel working so diligently in these criminal tribunals that we could remind ourselves occasionally when we talk about Guantanamo and other places. You know, we have reached a stage now in what is either the 5th or the 6th year of Darfur, and countless discussions and countless initiatives, a lot of very active NGO work, some governmental attention, some regional organizational attention, some UN attention. But I think the reality is we sort of need to view Darfur now, unfortunately and sadly, as sort of our next Middle East dilemma, our next Israeli-Palestinian dilemma. In other words, it is going on year after year after year. Peace talks are collapsing year after year after year. And of course, the carnage continues at a much higher rate, obviously, in Darfur than anywhere in the Israeli-Palestinian area. But the reality is that we seem to be getting stuck now in what for this generation will be our Israeli-Palestinian dilemma of trying to resolve these issues in this part of Africa, because not only is it Darfur, but we know that in southern Sudan, the difficulties in southern Sudan are beginning to rear their heads again in very, very significant fashion, and we don't have any answers right now for southern Sudan. We thought we did. Senator Danforth for the United States and many others had worked hard on a North-South agreement, and yet so much of that appears to be collapsing. So it's not just Darfur. We're watching now the impending arrival of a southern Sudan, not only atrocity situation, but political maelstrom as well, something we thought we had perhaps taken care of. And in fact, in all of our attention to southern Sudan in the early part of this decade, with Senator Danforth so engaged on it, the reality is within the United States government, there was a priority given to resolving the southern Sudan situation at the expense of immediately addressing the Darfur situation, on the theory that the two would conflict with each other, and the priority was to keep the southern Sudan negotiations on track. And of course, people patted themselves on the back when that was achieved with the North-South agreement, but we know what the cost is when another conflict and atrocity situation is not paid attention to as seriously as it should have in the early years. When I'm asked these questions about what do we do in Darfur, what are the policy prescriptions now, I do get to a stage now that I've been at, of course, with Iraq for several years, which is, all right, well, we are now where we are, right? In other words, when you asked me this question a year ago, we had a certain way of thinking about trying to resolve this situation. Another year has passed. Everyone wants to know what is the immediate answer for resolving it now. And it becomes, of course, a very frustrating exercise, not only for those of us outside of government, but obviously for so many within government who struggle with these issues, that as each year passes, another year transpires where you have to come up with some new great idea for how to resolve a problem that, if all hands had been on deck years ago and the focus had been applied years ago, we would not be trying to answer this question today. And I think we need to keep that very much in perspective. In November of 2005, because of my background in atrocity crimes during the Clinton administration, I was asked by Michael Gerson at the White House, who of course worked very closely with the president and who had a particular interest in Darfur, as you know, and was a speechwriter for President Bush, to come in and talk with him about Darfur. It was a fascinating 2 hours right next to the Oval Office in Michael's office. And I can remember, you know, the checklist of ideas and what initiatives could be taken right then and there in November of 2005 for a big United States push, which I think particularly Michael Gerson was very eager to see happen. And yet, of course, he had an entire federal government to deal with in order to make it happen. And I think back now at, well, that's almost 3 years ago when all of those issues were before us. Here we are again. I do want to point out something that Vincent was saying and put it in the context of a little bit of an update here. I assume all of you who are, you know, you're reading the newspapers and everything, you all realize that within just the last 3-4 months, the situation in Darfur has deteriorated considerably. In other words, we're in a downward spiral now. So we're not in some sort of optimist world of things are getting better in Darfur. We're in a very pessimistic stage now of things getting a lot worse in Darfur, enormously worse. And all you have to do is read up on this, look at the Eric Reeves articles, the New York, I mean, you know, the media has covered this to some extent, not enough, but to some extent. And you will see that we're confronting an issue right now in April of 2008 which, while we all may be sort of exhausted with it, quite frankly, the alarm bell should be going off in the White House and in the Security Council and in Westminster and the Quai d'Orsay. I mean, all these alarm bells should be going off right now. Right now, they should be going off. Because that's how bad the situation has developed on the ground with the ethnic cleansing assaults that are taking place in Darfur over the last few months. I also just want to say that when you go back to the origins of all of this 5-6 years ago, the immediate origins, and I know that my good friend Juan Mendez in the audience, who I'm so pleased to be sharing this room with here because he's been a champion in so many respects. We know that when we address a situation that is immediately unfolding like Darfur, there are those who rush to the podium to sort of slow the process down and say, well, wait a minute, now what is this? Is this a humanitarian situation? Is this genocide? We better check that out. And then in the process of checking out whether it's genocide, another 1.5 to 2 years go by, an enormous amount of death and destruction takes place, all because, or not all, but in some respects because of this terminological morass that we get ourselves into as to exactly how to identify these particular crimes before we can decide what is the policy prescription in response to them. It did lead, of course, to the Bush administration's determination that genocide has transpired in Darfur. That was not joined by most of the world, of course. It was in juxtaposition with the UN Commission of Inquiry that was led by Judge Antonio Cassese, which was the predicate to the UN's referral of Darfur to, the Security Council's referral of Darfur to the International Criminal Court. And that itself became a sort of self-destructive exercise because Judge Cassese and his legal colleagues, his lawyer colleagues on the panel, made a very, shall we say, rigorous determination that they could not conclude that genocide was taking place because they could not establish that the specific intent existed within the Darfur, the Sudanese political leadership. They could not establish even that a policy of genocide was being unleashed by Khartoum because they couldn't get at that specific intent requirement, which is very, very difficult in establishing in a courtroom, much less elsewhere. They were able to report, hey, we can't tell you it's genocide. Well, of course, the reverberations of that politically are to Khartoum's advantage, and it proved to be very much to Khartoum's advantage, to go through an exercise which concluded that, in fact, they were not exercising this, or they were not involved in this crime of genocide, despite the fact that the Commission found that they saw evidence of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and all of these should be taken as seriously, etc. The political impact, the media impact was to Khartoum's favor at that point. So I have certainly advocated a long time, I've got a lot published on this now, that we need to transform the terminology so that our reaction to this violence that takes place against large civilian populations can be far more readily identified as atrocity crimes, and then we can get to different stages where we identify them within the atrocity crimes basket as either war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. But policymakers need to be reacting to the sheer reality of atrocity crimes and not sitting there trying to parse between the words before they make the tough decisions I thought we were paying them to make. Now, I just want to point out there has been some legislation on Capitol Hill, and that is good. And a lot of the NGOs are responsible for this. The Genocide Intervention Network, Save Darfur, the Enough Project. I mean, all of these NGO entities are to be praised for their efforts on Capitol Hill. Let's not forget that there is the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act of 2006, which started the travel bans, the asset freezes on the leaders called upon the administration to influence NATO to act more effectively, encouraged U.S. aid to strengthen the peacekeeping force in the region, and led to an executive order by the president that helped shut down specific types of transactions with respect to the petroleum industry. Then there's the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act of 2007, just signed a few months ago in December of 2007. I find this a fascinating law and long overdue, but also for law schools, my God, we're going to be debating this forever. This is a federalism issue. And the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act basically permits, with statutory authority, permits states to engage in their own divestment programs with respect to situations, with respect to the Sudan situation. In other words, to divest from companies whose business relationships with Sudan fueled genocide, and to prohibit federal contracts with foreign companies funding the genocide, and to authorize states to prohibit contracts with companies that are engaged in activities that are related to Sudan and genocide. So it's a very forward-looking one. During the Clinton administration, we struggled so mightily with this concept on Burma and the whole federalism argument. It was a huge debate. We had great difficulty on Burma trying to, for example, permit the state of Massachusetts to do its own thing, to divest in companies related to doing business with Burma, et cetera, or investing in companies that do business, et cetera. So that's a very positive development. Final act that I want to talk about is the Genocide Accountability Act of 2007. Now, this is law now. It was signed in January of this year by the president. It does mean, finally, that if someone from Sudan arrives in the United States, there will be no political asylum for that individual. There'll be no asylum, shall we say, for that individual here. No political sanctuary, I should put it more precisely, in the sense that if that person can be associated with acts of genocide in Sudan, then our courts will be able to prosecute that individual for genocide. In the past, we could only prosecute American citizens who had engaged in genocide overseas or for genocide committed on American territory. Now, with this new law, anyone who commits genocide overseas of whatever nationality, if they dare come to U.S. territory, our U.S. attorneys can go after them, just the whole hog. That's a huge step forward in ensuring that our country is not a country of sanctuary for those who commit genocide. Now, I want to just quickly, I know I'm already bumping up against my time here, Susan. Oh, great. Okay, I got 5 minutes. All right. Let's just talk for a minute about the International Criminal Court. All right. We've got two individuals whose indictments are publicly known. Mr. Haroun, who is now, ironically, the minister who oversees the humanitarian fate of the Darfur people, and Mr. Kushab, who is a Janjaweed leader. Now, I put that out there because Prosecutor Ocampo came to the Security Council in December of last year, December 2007, and said, wait a minute. We have indicted two of the leaders of these atrocity crimes. We would like to see them arrive in The Hague for prosecution. We don't have a police force. You guys referred this to us under Chapter 7 Enforcement Authority under the UN Charter. You want to get up and start doing something about it? I'm putting my own words into it, but that was the nutshell of what he said. And it does raise a fascinating issue, which is when the Security Council uses Chapter 7 UN Charter Enforcement Authority to refer an atrocity situation to the ICC, is that the end of it? Or is there not some further responsibility on the part of the Security Council to make good on that Chapter 7 referral, and where there are needed steps for enforcement of certain vital functions of the court, such as We issue an indictment, we need someone arrested. What is the Security Council doing to ensure that these two indictees arrive in The Hague for prosecution? So he put that challenge to them. That leads then me to suggest, well, what could the United States do in this respect? Well, first of all, we're a permanent member of the Security Council, so the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act of 2006 opened the door with a suggestion that the United States could do some things to help the ICC. So why can't we use that influence on the Security Council, despite our knowledge that so many will stand there ready with their veto, to nonetheless raise the profile of this issue and challenge the Security Council to do the right thing and pursue these two men through various tools of pressure that the Security Council could bring upon Khartoum. For the United States government, there's also the issue of sharing some of our intelligence that could be declassified and made available to the ICC so that it could assist with their investigations. I mean, there's an enormous amount. We're already doing this, frankly, with commercial satellites in terms of aerial photography, but the point is there's an enormous amount, and I can speak from experience here, I think, where the United States government could say, look, we've packaged some information for you, we've declassified it, it's gone through the hoops, we've done our job bureaucratically. Here it is, run with it. It's called lead evidence. It's going to point you where you need to go. And then the final step is use the United States abilities in terms of equipping and providing the critical helicopter support that the peacekeeping force needs in order to get the right number of men and women on the ground, provide the humanitarian corridors that are needed for the humanitarian relief to come in on ground in Darfur, and that also assists the ICC in terms of getting to the right witnesses, building its cases, etc. Okay, now two final points, which I'm going to spend 30 seconds on each. The first is, I think we need to be even bolder. I think we need to pay attention to the fact that we're in the 6th year now. This is not just a joke anymore. This is the 6th year of this slaughter. It should be possible, along with the UN deployment, if that proves within a very short period of time to continue to run up against these sort of absurd non-consensual issues with Sudan about we don't want Nepalese soldiers, we don't want Thai soldiers, we don't want Swedish soldiers on our territory, which is sort of, you know, it's almost Jon Stewart time when you get to that level. That we really have to think as a government about, well, look, under international law, there is a principle called collective self-defense. And if there were any part of the world where it's needed, it's on the border between Chad and Sudan. Are we talking to the Chadian government about a request for collective self-defense? Because they're being inundated with hundreds of thousands of refugees. There's already this conflict taking place. Chadian government is noxious enough itself, but the point is we've got a lot of people at risk. And with collective self-defense, there's the ability, I think, particularly if we can extricate ourselves from Iraq, to have some better capability of boots on the ground to try to resolve the situation. As unrealistic as that sounds, 6 years after the fact, I think we have to sort of get over it and start talking about actually resolving the problem. And then my final proposal is this. I haven't talked about China and its influence with the Sudanese government. That could take another whole, discussion. I'll just boil it down to this. You've been reading a lot about all of this. You've been reading about the Olympic Games and Sudanese oil investments Chinese oil investments in Sudan, etc. What is it that could happen without any governmental initiative whatsoever? We don't have to, we don't have to force the White House to do anything, etc. And that is, I think the time has arrived now, and China, particularly with the Tibet experience, has proved its real scorecard in spades here, for a spectator boycott of the Beijing Olympics. There's absolutely no reason for any American to travel to Beijing to watch the Olympics. I think the athletes should go. I think the media should cover it. I think the sponsors should support the media and the teams. But we can all watch this from the United States. I think the athletes should actually encourage us to do this in support of human rights. I want them to go and compete for their medals and win them. But the idea that we would invest in the Chinese economy, in the hotels and the restaurants and everything else, and show our faces in Beijing during this kind of performance, or lack thereof, by the Chinese government, I think is simply, it's within our willpower. Stay home, watch it on TV, applaud them when they come home with their medals. Thank you very much.
And remember the Berlin Olympics. Thank you for the suggestions. Samuel Totten is our last panelist of the day, and I was quite pleased to realize that the gentleman who had been cut off twice in question periods was now going to be on the panel and get his chance to tell us things that he had tried to get up to the mic in the aisle to do from the prestige of the podium. He has done us the great favor of, on Friday, going downtown and being interviewed by Jerome McDonald for the Worldview show. And whenever one of our visitors can be on Worldview, we know that Jerome McDonald does a very good job of announcing events and making them known to his very wide listenership. And so I assume that there are at least a few of you here who heard about this conference through our partnership with WBEZ and through Samuel Totten's interview. Samuel Totten is a senior researcher as a Fulbright scholar, currently at the National University of Rwanda. He has come here all the way from Rwanda. He is also a genocide scholar at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, and will speak to us today on the U.S. State Department's Atrocities Documentation Project, Investigation, Findings, and Impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is an extreme honor to be here today, and an extreme honor to be on the panel with such esteemed members of the government, former government, academics, and activists. And it's great to see all of you here on a Saturday morning and afternoon as well. I greatly appreciate it. Much of what I was going to address, in part, was addressed by Ambassador Scheffer, and that's absolutely fine with me. He did a great job, and that allows me to address other issues. I'm only going to address the ADP, the Atrocities Documentation Project, for a couple of minutes, because I think it's much more important to talk about the aftermath, and that is the past 4 years, what has transpired in Darfur. The Atrocities Documentation Project was carried out by the U.S. government in 2004, during the summer of July and August. It was initiated by Roger Winters at the USAID. He spoke with his superior, Andrew Nazios, who was head of USAID at that time, about his concern and others in regard to what was transpiring in Darfur during that period of time. Now, we've all heard over and over again today the date 2003. I've conducted numerous interviews along the Chad-Darfur border. I was one of the 24 investigators with the U.S. State Department team in during the summer of 2004, but I've been back as well. And I can tell you that the attacks on the black Africans, and that's the way they refer to themselves, largely tribal groups from the Four, the Zagawa, and the Mausolete, started way before 2003. International attention was focused on Darfur in 2003. Some newspapers covered the situation in Darfur in 2001, as early as 2001, but attacks against the black Africans had been going on for close to a decade prior to that. I've met and interviewed people who told me that they had experienced up to a half a dozen attacks on their villages in the 1990s. And basically what they said is that when these attacks took place, they would And the attacks took place at the hands of what they refer to as the Janjaweed, the Arab militia largely, and sometimes the GOS, Government of Sudan troops. The attacks would take place, and oftentimes females, and I force myself to say females and not women, because it's important to realize that girls as young as 8 years old have suffered gang rape in Darfur over the years. So women is a misnomer in that sense, but from 8 years old up through 50 and older have been suffering rape at the hands of their attackers since the 1990s. But what my understanding is that these attacks were taking place in 1990s, and the villages were not burnt to the ground as they were in 2003, 4, 5, on through today. But the attackers would come in, oftentimes in the 1990s, exactly the same way the attacks were carried out in the early 2000s, and that is the Janjaweed would come in from different angles, 200, 300, 400 strong on camels and horses, attack people in their fields. They would generally attack in the morning, and the initial attack by the Janjaweed would be followed by the GOS in four-wheel vehicles. The villages were partially burned down, but not entirely burned down. And generally the people fled, and they would often flee out to the wadis, that is, those areas, riverbeds that swell during the rainy season. And they would hide out there, and once the Janjaweed and the GOS left, they would go back home, and they would resume their lives. Now, some people would leave after the second attack, some after the third, some after the fourth, some after the fifth, and some after the sixth. And they would either go to another part of Darfur, where the IDP camps were formed, and many would flee across the border to Chad, just across the border. So this has been going on for a long time, but the international community started to focus on it in 2003. So during the summer of 2004, the United States government hired a group called the Coalition for International Justice, which was based in Washington, D.C. It's now defunct. But to carry out this investigation, they hired what they called 24 investigators from around the world. We had people from Australia, England, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. Many of them were lawyers. Many had worked with either the ICTY or the ICTR. There were a number of police investigators as well, and 2 genocide scholars, myself and Eric Markison, who sadly died just about a year ago, January, from pancreatic cancer. And after having been in the Chad region, both of us decided that we weren't going to be there once, but we were going to dedicate a good part of our lives over the course of the next couple of years, however long it took, to go back and forth. In fact, we were planning a trip, and he ended up dying pretty abruptly after being told that he had pancreatic cancer. But basically what we did during the summer of July 2004 and early August 2004 is that we interviewed approximately 1,130 black Africans. We had an 8-page questionnaire. Every single investigator asked the same set of questions. The interviews generally went for an hour to 2 hours. As that information was collected, it was sent back to Washington, D.C., and analyzed by an outside agency, and then returned to the U.S. State Department, where it was reanalyzed. On September 9th, 2004, as you probably all know, Colin Powell, based on the analysis of the data collected by this ADP team, declared that genocide had been perpetrated and possibly was still being perpetrated in Darfur. He made that statement at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and at that time he also said, this determination does not mean that we need to do anything other than we've already done. And what the United States did then was refer the matter under Chapter 7 to the United Nations. And as it's been mentioned several times today, the United Nations carried out its own investigation in December of 2004, January 2005, and in late January declared that it found that the GOS and John Jouid had not perpetrated genocide, but crimes against humanity. And then, as we've heard several times today, that that did not mean that the crimes were any less significant. Other investigations have been carried out since. Physicians for Human Rights carried out another investigation in 2005. They declared that the situation was genocide. Interestingly, the GOS, the government of Sudan, conducted its own investigation, and not surprisingly, came to the conclusion that largely this was much to do about nothing. It refuted a lot of the evidence, claims made by both the UN and the United States government, and of course we know where we're at today. I just want to share with you some of the findings, though, of the United States briefly. Individuals witnessed or experienced the following, and I'm going to give you the percentage based again on this roughly 1,100 person study. Killing of family members, 61%. Killing of non-family members, 67%. Death from displacement, 28%. Rape, 16%. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Hearing racial epithets, 33%. Village destruction, 81%. Aerial bombing, generally the GOS used Antonov planes to bomb the villages in 2003, 2004, and actually they're still bombing to this very day. As Ambassador Scheffer said, the violence has increased dramatically over the past several months, and the bombings have resumed to a great extent. Also, destruction of personal property, 55%, and looting of personal property, 47%. A lot of this, you know, you use those phrases and it doesn't mean all that much, but when you talk to these people face to face, you begin to appreciate that their personal property, and I'm talking about bags of seed, sorghum, it's basically their form of currency. And when they lose that, they lose almost everything. Also, when these villages were attacked in 2003 and 2004, frequently the Jean Jouid and or the GOS would take human bodies, dead human bodies, carcasses of animals, and throw them in the wells to poison the wells. Now, what you have to understand is not all of Darfur is in a zone that's extremely hot and desert-like. However, there is a large part of it that is, and there are regions that reach 130 degrees. So people are not going to last long without water. So when we look at the process of killing, I believe that we don't only look at the actual shooting or the bombings, but what has transpired after the fact, that is, after the people have been forced from their homes, from their villages, and then seeking shelter in some rough IDP camp or some refugee camp in Chad. I could go on and on about the ADP, but and the COI by the UN, but what I think we need to look at is the aftermath, and that is the past 3 years, certainly since January, when the United Nations declared that what had transpired in Darfur was crimes against humanity. We've heard a number of statements about the different resolutions that have been passed by the UN. We've heard about some of the progress that has been made, whether it's at the United States level or the UN level, in regard to trying to react, trying to address the situation in Darfur. But the fact is, the killing has gone on, off and on, over the past 5 to 6 years, and the way I describe it is it's like peaks and valleys. I mean, if you graphed it, it would be peaks and valleys, and unfortunately, we're going up a mountain right now. And villages continue to be attacked. Tens of thousands literally continue and have continued over the past 3 or 4 months to flee from their homes. Girls and women have been raped, and the IDP camps are no safer, really, I think, than they were 4 years ago. At a recent conference in Kigali, Rwanda, the commander from the new UNAU force attended, and he had some very interesting comments to make. One is, he predicted that the UNAU troops, meaning the number of troops, would certainly not be reached before, and we're talking that roughly 26,000 number that we've heard, would not be reached at least until December 2008 and possibly early 2009. He stated that currently there are 9,000 troops in Darfur. There are roughly 2.5 million IDPs in Darfur. And as mentioned several times, that 3-state area is extremely large. We've heard people compare it to France. Other people compare it to the size of Texas. The commander made it very, very clear that they're still undermanned, they're still under-resourced. And I'll give you some specifics. He stated that recently, the UNAU force was provided with 150 basically armored vehicles, APCs, and he said that every single one of them was in such poor shape that they, quote unquote, trashed them. Ambassador Scheffer mentioned the fact that he thinks it would be wise if the United States went ahead and provided more resources, and he mentioned specifically helicopters. The commander mentioned that they basically have 2 helicopters to use. And that's a pretty ludicrous situation. Since March 2008, the commander mentioned that the ever-increasing number of splinter groups, meaning from the rebels, has reached roughly the number of 20. That is, there are 20 now factions, 20 factions or splinter groups from the original 2 rebel groups. And it's obvious that the more they splinter, the more they fight, the more difficult it is to bring the situation under control. Now, I've heard the number as high as 28. I don't know. But the fact is, again, as the ambassador said, if this had been addressed 4 years ago, or when the U.S. made the declaration that genocide had been perpetrated, or 5 years ago when the UN declared that it was crimes against humanity, we wouldn't be facing really what is turning into chaos now, because not only do we have these 20 rebel groups, factions, but we now have rebel groups fighting rebel groups, Janjaweed fighting Janjaweed, and you still have the GOS and the Janjaweed bombing villages. Now, about 2 years ago, a statement was made that over and over again, that the GOS and Janjaweed were now attacking IDPs because there weren't any villages left to bomb. That was plain wrong. They're finding villages to bomb. They're finding villages to attack, and they are continuing to be attacked. I was last along the Chad-Darfur border this summer, and while I was there were attacks carried out at that time. There's a story of a 101-year-old man who was burned to death, and it raises the question in my mind, you know, what is behind the Janjaweed and the GOS killing babies, killing children, killing the elderly, all under the guise of going after the rebels. Each and every time there's an attack by the GOS or Janjaweed, they say that they're going after rebel strongholds. And yet, time and again, they continue to attack babies, the elderly, girls, and women. Well, you know and I know that those babies aren't carrying weapons. You know and I know a 101-year-old man is most likely not carrying a weapon. And those girls who are being gang raped, often simply going out to collect firewood because the men are fearful of being attacked, they're not carrying weapons. Crimes against humanity or genocide, I've heard over and over again today that it doesn't really matter. I would beg to differ. And the reason I beg to differ is this. Number one, did the United Nations really need to go into Darfur and the camps in Chad in December 2004, January 2005 to ascertain that crimes against humanity had been perpetrated? I don't think so. I think that was rather obvious. The question is, a big point was made about the fact that they did not find genocide. I would submit that the very issue of genocide has drawn attention to this issue of Darfur. Now, I would be the first one to agree that the people on the ground don't care what you call it. But I think it does matter to the international community, and I think it's drawn the attention of the international community. I mean, there's a reason why Nicholas Kristof is called the Olympics, the Genocide Olympics. There's a reason why this conference has the word genocide in it. There's a reason why people debate whether these actions constitute genocide or not. And I know I'm out of time. I guess in closing, say that there's a certain gravitas, I guess, about the word and concept genocide. I happen to agree, and I find his arguments very compelling, and I'm talking about Ambassador Scheffer again. He has a very compelling argument in regard to addressing these actions as atrocities, and I just want to say, he's written a very fine article about that. It's appeared in Genocide Studies and Prevention, and actually the editors of Genocide Studies and Prevention then carried on a debate among scholars around that concept. And I think that this moving to such a term, atrocities, might help in moving us forward in regard to the issue of prevention versus intervention versus reacting after the fact when it's too late and people are dead and dying in a far-off land such as Darfur. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, and then I will do some very quick concluding remarks. They're not going to be like another session, so just at the tail end of the question period. Questions for our panelists, and taking a cue from David Scheffer, we want to encourage questions particularly for Vincent and for Samuel Totten, because they came so far. David Scheffer, we'll bring you back to campus soon, because we want to spend more time having dialogue. Questions? People can come up to the mic with questions. I know everyone's tired.
You might ask me how I could respond to Samuel's final point about terminology.
Okay, we'll start with that. And then, Babafemi, you have a question?
Let me just say that as I've written, I still think genocide is an extremely powerful term to use very effectively and pragmatically during the violence. What I've tried to suggest is that because of my own experience with Rwanda and then with Kosovo, where this term became an issue of great toil within the administration, I wanted to sort of shift the debate to say policymakers, and I did this with Kosovo within days of the Serb assault into Kosovo. I got the clearance within the government to go before the press and say, look, you know, these are the early stages. Our intelligence is showing A, B, C, and D in terms of what's happening on the ground. And we have concluded that we can say to you that what we see happening on the ground are indicators of genocide, and we should take that as seriously as that speaks to. In other words, we are witnessing what for all intents and purposes appears to be an unfolding genocide. We don't have to sit here and technically say it's genocide. We'll just say it's indicators. And then in my scholarship after my government service, I torqued that on the advice of people smarter than me to say, look, in the terminology of academia, indicators has a much longer time span to it, 10, 15, 20 years, or what indicate the emergence ultimately of genocide. And that when you're talking about more imminent events occurring on the ground, you need to find another word, otherwise there'll be confusion in academic circles. Although I thought it made it worked with the media, it worked with the public. So I've changed that to say, for policymakers, don't be hesitant to stand up at the right moment and say, look, there are atrocity crimes occurring. We think it would appear as if there are precursors to genocide occurring on the ground, and they are as follows. That allows a policymaker who's not necessarily a lawyer, but still someone, including spokesman for the State Department, to be able to get up there and discuss the seriousness of what is occurring without getting into this media baiting debate about, well, now precisely what do you think it is? Which is what we got trapped on Rwanda. The spokeswoman who rose in early June of 1994 and got slaughtered by the media actually had not been briefed on the memo that Secretary Christopher had signed 2 weeks earlier stating that genocide was unfolding in Rwanda. So there was a disconnect internally within the department, but at the same time, her job could have been so much easier if we'd had a different premise upon which we used terminology to describe all of this.
Thank you. Before Babafemi asks his question, I want to again acknowledge his intellectual leadership of the development of this conference, his reluctance to take a protagonist role and be up here addressing all of you, and thank him publicly for his 2 years of service as our postdoctoral human rights fellow. He's going to be joining the faculty of Western Washington State University in the fall, and we will be sorry to see him go and look forward to his question right now. Sorry to embarrass you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. My question is a generic one. If the conflict in Darfur is environmental, as some people have said, would our responses be different? Would we approach it the same way we are approaching it, the use of force and intervention and all that? If indeed it is an environmental issue. The second question, After this conference, President Omar al-Bashir calls each of you and says, I have heard your comments. What can I do? Give me advice. What will you suggest to him? Thank you.
Vincent?
Was the first question was, is it an environmental issue? Is that what you said?
If it were.
If it were.
Like an environment.
If it were, how would it be
Oh.
seen differently?
Oh, I see, okay. Let me think about that for a second. I have my answer for al-Bashir, but I'll wait until we address the first question.
We can see why Baba Femi is a good teacher. He asks challenging questions.
Well, if it were environmental, as someone who has taught international environmental law, you may not have boundaries, really, on which to dichotomize issues, particularly. Remember that we have what we now call environmental crimes or environmental justice. Of course, maybe not necessarily rising to the point whereby we say they're genocide, but they may well be. If you know the principle of not in my backyard, and if it happened to be that Darfur was being targeted for the purposes of some environmental crisis, for example, the deposition of nuclear wastes on the Darfur land, then it becomes a very big issue as well, irrespective of whether or not we could say it is really genocide or crimes against humanity. But mind you also, environmental crimes can as well be such that could rise up to crimes against humanity because they may not necessarily be on the basis of war, except war crimes, of course. So again, I know your questions are academically challenging, but at the same time, what impact, I think my reaction will be, what impact would the environmental crisis created on Darfur land have on the lives of ordinary people in Darfur? And that would indeed result in some kind of reaction by the international community or even by us standing here and talking about it.
On the environmental front, I would say that the question comes, I think, from a real background in Darfur, because we know that there are environmental causes for some of the misery and the situation that the people of Darfur find themselves in now. So there are some environmental characteristics to it. I would think that the ICC, which is investigating all of this, of course, does have an opportunity within the Rome Statute of the ICC in the war crimes section to address if particularly the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed are in fact undertaking steps that have a severe environmental destructive consequence, then that's not entirely outside of the jurisdiction of the court to take a look at in the context of war crimes. But that's about as far as I can go on that. Let me take a jump, if I may, and then I'll turn it over to Samuel and Vincent on if President Bashir called me, which he will not. But if he were to do so, my answers are you know, as obvious as they would be if he were to call you, which is, one, he needs to demonstrate his confidence in his own subordinates by, in fact, permitting those who have been indicted to appear before the Hague, defend themselves vigorously before the Hague. After all, if they are undertaking policies which are legitimate under international law, they should be there to defend those policies. So that would be one point I would make, that he's not gaining any traction with the international community by denying the transit of those individuals to the Hague. As illogical as it may sound to him, that's the reality of the world. We are in a world where it is not yet the end of impunity, but there is an enormous pressure point within the international community to deal with allegations of impunity at the highest levels, and he's not immune from that whatsoever. And frankly, it's not going away. Secondly, I would just suggest as I said in my talk, that it's become transparently clear why, or the tactic he's using to obstruct the full deployment of the peacekeeping forces by denying non-African forces on the ground in large numbers. And that, there's no credibility left to that particular argument. Although I would also say that it would be helpful for the African Union to be as clear as possible about that point, just as an additional leverage point on the President.
I guess in regard to the environmental issue, I'd say that, of course, this crisis has not been caused by the environmental situation entirely, but it certainly has impacted the situation. What I mean by that is, as many of you probably know, back in the 90s, the nomadic herders would come down because of the severe drought in the mid-'80s, which was followed by a famine, would reach down lower and lower into parts of Darfur and ultimately encroach on the land of the sedentary farmers who were largely black Africans. And that caused a certain amount of conflict. For years and years, I mean, there's been conflict, low-level intensity, but it's often been dealt with by what they refer to as the umdas or the sheikhs, but generally the umdas who are over the sheikhs. And it would be handled in a conflict resolution type situation, and whenever the case may call for it, there'd be what they refer to as blood money, and that is infractions would be paid with cows or something along that line. But it's not solely an environmental issue. There's this whole concept that we haven't mentioned today, I don't think, of pan-Arabism, where Gaddafi at one point in time had plans to have this large swath of Africa basically become fundamentalist. He wanted to establish basically a fundamentalist state over a large swath of land. And at that point in time, Arabs were being given very powerful positions over and above black Africans within Darfur. And as a result of that, the Arab herders often would come down and basically tell black Africans that they were going to use the land. And I heard this over and over again. We're here, we're going to use the land as long as we want. And if you've got a problem with that, speak to the Kalash, meaning the Kalashnikov. And this was going on as early as the early 1990s. So it's an environmental issue, but also a political issue. As far as what I'd say to al-Bashir, what I'd like to say is, well, why don't you and your government step down? But I guess he wouldn't listen to that, obviously. But I would say that maybe an important start would be to honor the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that was signed with the Southern Sudan. That wasn't solely for Southern Sudan, but the concept behind it was to try to implement a more democratic way of life throughout Sudan, and that would certainly be a start in the right direction, but it would also mean that they would have to dismantle many of the current positions that Arabs are in Darfur and who were placed there over and above black Africans. And that's a complicated issue, and it would take a lot of time to go into detail, but that would be a start.
Well, if he were to call me, first of all, I'll ask him to pay a very large consultation fee. That's just kidding. But I would tell him to allow Africans to exist in their land and not force them to be Arabs, because there is indeed a discovery of the fact that the whole intention is to, whether it is to Arabianize or Arabize the entire Sudan, as the motivating factor for some of this. And secondly, I will ask him not to frustrate the efforts of the peacekeeping mission if he had no hidden agendas. To open up the place to enable the peacekeepers do their job, rather than, if you like, shadowing every action that the peacekeeping mission takes as a way of gathering intelligence as to what their next move is. And I will also ask him to indeed live up to the obligations he accepted under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which every African country has ratified, as well as the Constitutive Act of the African Union, and do the right thing in terms of ensuring that the rights of the ordinary people are not trampled upon. And finally, I would ask him to organize free and fair elections, recognizing the principles enshrined of autonomy under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Whether you like it or not, Darfur is now being referred to as Western Sudan, but remember that Darfur is south of Sudan and should have really been affected by the overall comprehensive agreement between the Northern Sudan and Southern Sudan, because the entire problem of Darfur today cannot be divorced from the problems of Southern Sudan. Thank you.
Another question?
Hi. You guys spoke with great emphasis today on the importance of terminology and identifying terminology. And I guess my question is in relation to that. In relation to prevention, how much evidence is enough evidence to go in and prevent some atrocity like this? And also in relation to that, I mean, I don't personally remember seeing any sort of media exposure to that in the early years. So where exactly was the media representation in this so that, you know, we could have had some kind of international outcry for change? That's pretty much my question, so thanks.
Well, let me take your second question first, if I may, and then pass it down the line. But we have to remember these initial attacks were taking place in the late 80s, early 1990s, and we have to understand and appreciate what was taking place at that time, of course. We had the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then we had the situation in former Yugoslavia that went for a decade. We had Rwanda in 94, Srebrenica in 95. A lot of issues, a lot of hot issues end up being addressed on page 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of newspapers. The coverage might be erratic, might not catch the eye of people. It might be a situation of, well, you know, there goes Africa again, or there goes a country. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why it didn't catch the eye. I mean, it was the 1990s obviously were an extremely complex time, and there was a lot going on, and the focus was elsewhere, I would say, you know, to a large extent. Not an excuse, but unfortunately facts of life.
Sorry, I'll be much more cynical than that. The reason why it never came up, because it happened in Africa. Because the first full-scale war in Darfur was reported to have happened in 1987 to 1989, in which 2,500 people were killed. And the second one was in 1996. And of course, the current one is that which happened in 2003 as a result of the build-up effects of the prior conflicts. So again, whether you like it or not, Africa has never been at the center of world attention. And we cannot emphasize that enough. But we thank God that things are changing in terms of now that the world is drawing attention to the issues, and not a very sincere attention anyway, because it either impacts oil or something else for that attention to be drawn. Unfortunately, that is a reality in terms of nations working as a result of their interests. But I think we could have a more neutral way of looking at things. I think if there were serious early warning systems in the international arena, there would have been a need to talk about prevention It is only not too long ago that the UN began to address the issues of trying to find out some kind of early warning systems under the auspices of receiving particular advice from the point of view of prevention of genocide, the office that Professor Mendes occupied in the last few years. So again, why did the world not rise up to this? The same answer that resulted in the world not rising up to Darfur, to Rwanda in 1994 could well have been the case with regard to Darfur when it started. And only recently, as I said, maybe the world got a wake-up call after Rwanda and Yugoslavia to say, oh, maybe what is happening now in Darfur could very well rise up to that. Why not we do something? And still, nothing is being done.
But even during the times of increased emphasis on it, wouldn't media images influence the decision-making process to expedite it? I mean, I see like a lot of beating around the bush, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but to actually get things done.
I agree with you, media images. African media images don't really make it to the cable TVs, to the CNN, except when Somalia happened and American soldiers were being dragged. Then those images began to come.
Do you feel that it's a degree of separation, like both emotionally and physically, from these events that might have slowed it down?
Definitely, if the media were to be universally applicable in terms of how they cover the news, sure. And of course, Sudan is not a particularly friendly country in terms of the government of al-Bashir or those who ruled even before him in terms of allowing outside participation in what is happening in the country. All said and done, we will not deny the fact that Africa had not really been much of a focus. But again, hopefully, things are changing for the better. And it's unfortunate that even now, the soldiers that are supposed to be there are not yet there. The helicopters that are supposed to be provided, the heavy materials are not yet there. I listened to an interview granted by the force commander, who happens to be the former chief of staff of the Nigerian army, said, why on earth did I take this job? Because it is getting very frustrating. Because he's not been able to get the materials and men and women that he needs to use to do the work. So it is quite daunting, and we are asking the question, why? Why is the world not rising up, supplying the materials that are needed? While al-Bashir may well be saying, well, the African character of the mission must be emphasized, and need African soldiers and all that. Even if you get 26,000 African soldiers, without the support of the international community to provide the helicopters, the armored personnel carriers that are needed, the weapons, are they going to protect the place with their bare hands? Those are the issues.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is get whatever remaining questions there are out and then have the panelists respond. So I know you have a question. Ma'am, did you move up because you have a question too? Okay, so we'll get the questions and then the panelists can respond to both.
My name is Peter Bull. I'm Sudanese. I'm with the Sudanese community here. I was in Juba in January, and from my own experience, what I've been hearing, we all know that people of Southern Sudan were forced, to sign the fee they have signed in January in 2005, and that was because we know that the Bashir government was not interested in these fees, and we know it was not going to be implemented. So with the history that I was hearing while I was in Sudan, people from Southern Sudan actually, although majority of them are not even informed about what is taking place in Darfur, they are now preparing for another war, hopefully in 2009, because they really don't believe this war will be implemented. But anyway, my question is, at the end of the day, if we find it that, as speakers has been talking about it yesterday and today, that the African Union don't have the capability to deal with this crisis in Darfur, or maybe because of many other crises that are happening within the Africa themselves, in Chad, in Darfur, in Ethiopia, and many African countries, that they are not accessible to do anything in Darfur. And then coming to the UN at the same time, that if they are not even in position to address this because of so many interests that are actually the problem now within the UN Security Council, it might end of the day come to the Sudanese to find a way to deal with it. But for the Sudanese to deal with this crisis without the help of international community, I think the international community might also want to get out of Sudan. I mean, those who are investing with the government of Southern Sudan. So my question is, I would like you to suggest to the audience here some ways maybe we can confront countries like China who are investing in Sudan, and not only China, because we know I was here some months ago, we were protesting here, at least for the University of Chicago, to even divest in Sudan. So I would like you to suggest some way maybe we could, confront these countries who are investing with Sudan, because this so much for the gift to the Sudanese government, that is what even makes them stronger to commit this crime.
And next question? Yeah, we wanted to do the questions together and let the panelists synthesize some answers.
I don't know if this is a question. I'm not a student nor a teacher here. I'm just interested. I would like to comment to Mr. Totten. I heard you on WBEZ yesterday. You sound very sincere, and I appreciated that. My question is, the UN. It seems like we need to disavow the UN. I don't understand how we can support the UN. Rwanda is on their watch. Sarajevo is on their watch. All of these problems are on their watch. So if they cannot solve the problems any faster than they are, we don't need the UN. Are not most of the countries represented in the United Nations Christian nations? And all of these countries call on God, and they are allowing this to happen. We don't need the UN. Has anyone suggested that we dissolve the UN? I'm serious. Rwanda is on their watch. And this is the second one. No, not the second, the third. That's my question.
Thank you. We can take, I guess, starting from Samuel Totten, come across and responses and final remarks if you have some.
Well, certainly a lot of people have talked about shutting down the UN, but that's not going to happen, I don't think. I think we have to appreciate the fact that the UN is comprised of the individual nations across the globe. So, we focus on the UN, but it comes down to an issue of realpolitik, and we've heard this over and over again today, the whole issue of lack of political will. Personally, I do have a problem with the UN Security Council, the Permanent Five. The problem there is one vote virtually, one veto can shut down a resolution. And we've seen that happen over and over again during this 6-year period or so, 5 to 6 year period in regard to Darfur on certain resolutions. Now, certain resolutions have passed, but we have seen one resolution made after another, and we've seen no action as far as I'm concerned, from my perspective, of protecting the people on the ground. We have seen some action here and there that seems to be positive. I think Ambassador Scheffer mentioned a number of those that are important, but again, as far as protecting the people on the ground, it's not happening. The force commander in Kigali said as much. They don't have the personnel. That's been said probably half a dozen times today. They don't have the weapons. They don't have the vehicles. They don't even have the vehicles, enough vehicles on the ground, let alone aircraft. I also heard from another source that I'm not at liberty to say who it is, and I'm not trying to sound mysterious, but I promised him or her that I wouldn't provide a name. But I also understand that there are, and possibly Mr. Mendez could speak to this because he certainly knows a lot more than I do about this, that there are basically 3 layers of three layers of hierarchy, so to speak, within Rwanda. And I understand that the UNAU force ultimately answers to a group of retired military officials who have been hired. Now, that sounds absurd, but that's what somebody high up in the AU said. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes the AU, before it goes out to a certain region or takes a certain action, has to get an okay to do so. I've also heard through the grapevine that the government of Sudan has actually demanded that the AU not use certain frequencies on radios when the GOS troops are in a certain region of Darfur. It's also well documented today that, and I'll end with this, that the GOS has periodically, more than once, whitewashed planes and slapped on UN insignias to ship military personnel and weapons to Darfur. I mean, there are great problems, but when we look at the UN, we have to look at who comprises the UN as individual nations, and it's largely the permanent five that dictate what happens when it comes to UN Security Council decisions.
Thank you.
I'll just follow up very briefly by saying on the first question that was raised by our friend from Sudan, that as I understood it, what are some ways to confront the Janjaweed and countries supporting Sudan? Now, we've talked a bit about that this afternoon, and I would simply reiterate that it is very, very important in confronting governments that the United States government have a sufficient amount of credibility in those diplomatic endeavors. I think we've had some difficulty in recent years sustaining that kind of credibility, so that if our president sits down with China, how much weight does he bring to the table? How much moral suasion does he bring to the table? To what extent does he impress upon his Chinese hosts that he's actually bringing the whole international community to the table, so please perk up. That's an issue in terms of the power of this country and whether or not we still have it at the table when we deal with China, or perhaps, for example, for Egypt. Egypt has tremendous influence with respect to Sudan. It has a very tortured history of recent years with Sudan, but I think it could have influence within the African Union and with Khartoum if we had that kind of influence with Egypt. And then finally, by, as I said, by taking steps where we could facilitate the work of the International Criminal Court, I think we'd be demonstrating to Khartoum that there really is no way out with respect to the issue of accountability before that court. So the better way to deal with that is friendly, rather than trying to resist it and ultimately risk the entire survival of the government over that resistance to the court.
Well, adding my voice, you cannot, unfortunately, you cannot dissolve the UN. Well, we'll do the best we can, but I wonder what the result will be. In terms of China and other countries or entities that invest in Sudan, it's quite unfortunate. We sit here at the University of Chicago, and I know that the students have their movement in terms of whether or not the university here should divest, which is a very simple, not very simple, but very much close to home, and there doesn't seem to appear to be any interest in that regard. Rather, the student could easily be muzzled one way or the other when they continue to make their protests in this regard. How much more China, which is a permanent member of the Security Council, which can very well become antagonistic to the whole process of trying to call it to order in terms of its dealings with Sudan. Also, other developed countries have not made things easier in terms of their economic policies towards Africa, which has resulted in some kind of attraction to China, which has said, well, you know, those guys across the Atlantic treat you as slaves, but we are ready to treat you as equals. We're not ready to listen to whatever your records may be at home. And we can assure you you have a good deal in terms of the trade between us. It becomes a very, very difficult problem. Do we have an answer to it? We really don't, in terms of, because we are not the ones to muster the political will. But we can, as activists and as human rights people, to raise this awareness and possibly do some boycotts. The Olympics is an issue. Whether you like it or not, the negative publicity is hurting China badly. Unfortunately, the Tibetan crushing of the Tibetan protests appears to be bearing more fruit than China's involvement in Darfur or in Sudan. Again, am I suspicious? Reaction to African issues again by the developed world. What can we do?
Thank you. We'd like to thank our panelists. I have a couple of thank yous and then some closing remarks. First of all, I want to thank again the coordinating committee for all of their work they did to pull this conference together, and particularly standing at the back door, Sarah Moberg and Jamie Bender, who really put their hearts, souls, energies, intelligence into this conference. And you always have to make visible the invisible. When logistics are done well, you don't notice them. And so that's why I think it's particularly important to thank the people who made us able to concentrate on the substance of this very important topic today. So thank you again, Sarah and Jamie. I'd like to call your attention to another major event on the calendar of the Human Rights Program. On Thursday evening, June 5th, in this room, we're going to have the second annual Dr. Robert Kirshner Memorial Lecture. Dr. Kirshner was a beloved teacher here and world-renowned forensic pathologist. He would have been delighted to be here today. Many of you know him, many of you have worked with him. And we have, courtesy of his family, a fund which supports an annual human rights lecture in his name. This year the speaker will be noted Chicago writer Alex Kotlowitz, whose work on issues of racism and the welfare of children touch on interests that were very central to Bob Kirshner's career. We will also, at that event on June 5th, be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Human Rights Program here at the University of Chicago. So we welcome you all back. Since you're on our mailing list, you will get invited to those events. And then I wanted to thank all of you for coming. You have given up the first nice Saturday of spring after a really awful winter we've had here in Chicago. And I want to thank our panelists for having helped all of us to broaden, deepen, and focus our knowledge about genocide in general, about various genocides in their historical specificity, about the responses, about interventions, about preventions, and hopefully have set off in all of us various alarm bells which will compel us to look more closely and act more strongly on issues like and the issue of Darfur and the other problems in the world today. I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to visit the tables at the back of the room where there may still be literature left from the organizations we invited to participate. And any of you who are teachers or want to understand what teachers do are welcome to stay in this room for the teacher training workshop on teaching genocide that will take place starting about 10 minutes from now up here at the front of the room. So thank you all for attending. To all of our speakers again for taking the time and traveling the distances.